One of the reasons that Tennessee farmers were poor was that they had few tools. The tools that would have benefited them the most were things like tractors, hay balers, corn pickers, all powered by diesel fuel or gasoline. So TVA electricity all by itself could not have transformed the lives of these poor farmers. And ironically, TVA electricity, although subsidized, was no bargain. Oil and gas, natural gas, were cheaper for home heating. The TVA was an irrational, extravagant monopoly that demonstrated how public ownership meant evasion of public control. Battelle Institute economist William Chandler explained that, quote, the TVA was compelled by law to build Norris Dam. It was instructed by Roosevelt to build Wheeler Dam as a jobs project. It was forced by the necessity to survive constitutional challenges, in other words, interstate commerce, to build a navigation channel for interstate commerce, cost of which didn't pay back for over 40 years. A dubious type of investment to make when money was tight during the Great Depression. Chandler added, quote, nor was the TVA accountable to the marketplace. It did not need to be profitable or self-financing. Thus, it lacked incentive to undertake economically rational projects. It could sell power at subsidized rates, having to pay neither interest nor taxes. It was not accountable to any voter or subject to the usual legislative checks and balances. It has been claimed that the TVA promoted flood control, but that's considering only land downstream of the dams. The TVA actually flooded more land than it saved behind the dams. For example, the TVA flooded some 243,000 acres of land, mostly belonging to poor farmers, in order to protect the 8,700 acres of industrial and other property in Chattanooga, where people were considerably better off than the farmers whose land had been flooded. And I might add that thousands of black people, black sharecroppers, were dispossessed of their land, and they got no compensation from the TVA. Ninth, FDR launched frivolous antitrust lawsuits against some 150 employers and industries. There was never any evidence that private monopoly was more pervasive during the 1930s than it had been in decades before, or that, for that matter, in the decades since. It was ironic that FDR blamed continuing double-digit unemployment on monopolies, since he himself had promoted monopolies like the TVA. He had promoted some 700 industrial cartels and cut back production. This is under the National Industrial Recovery Act, and it forced prices above market levels. Nonetheless, FDR's antitrust lawsuits tied up employers in court and made it harder to focus on growth and jobs. And 10th, FDR channeled New Deal spending and loan programs away from the poorest people who lived in the South. Counting the Works Progress Administration, the Rural Resettlement Administration, the Rural Electrification Administration, and all the rest, the bulk of New Deal spending and loan programs went to political swing states in the West and the East, where incomes were at least 60% higher than in the South. As an incumbent, FDR apparently did not see much point giving a lot of money to the South, where voters were already overwhelmingly on his side. And I might add, incumbents of both parties behaved exactly the same way. As for the so-called workfare programs like the WPA, they did not increase the number of jobs in the economy, because the money spent on New Deal programs came from taxpayers who consequently had less money to spend on food, coats, cars, and all sorts of other things that would have stimulated the economy. This is a classic case of the seen versus the unseen. We can see the jobs created by big government spending. We cannot see the jobs destroyed by big government taxing. It has been suggested that New Deal workfare recipients should be counted among the productively employed, and this would yield lower unemployment numbers for the New Deal period. But however worthwhile cleaning parks, painting post offices, and other such projects might have been, they had nothing to do with what ought to have been the #1 priority of the 1930s, namely reviving private sector employment, since the private sector is the only sector capable of sustained human progress. One might add that New Deal workfare jobs did not help people develop the skills or the values needed to thrive in the private sector. I'm reminded of Louis Armstrong's tune, the WPA, that was recorded in 1940, and you can hear it on the internet. It includes these lines: sleep while you work, rest while you play, lean on your shovel to pass the time away at the WPA. I'm so tired, don't know what to do, can't get fired, so I take my rest till the work is through. Don't be a fool. Hard work is passé. Sit down and joke while you smoke. It's okay at the WPA. There will always be policy mistakes that slow down an economy. What distinguished the New Deal was an unprecedented succession of blows. It was so tragic because during the second quarter of 1933, soon after the banks were reopened, the economy started to recover. Durable and non-durable goods production was way up. Factory employment was up about 35% by July of 1933. Economist Gene Smiley, after analyzing the growth of that period, concluded that if the economy had continued to recover as it started to in the second quarter of 1933, unemployment would have been under 5% by October of 1934. But of course, that never happened. In the summer of 1933, the economy went into a relapse, a consequence of some of the 100 Days legislation, in particular the Securities Act that made it harder for employers to raise capital, and the National Industrial Recovery Act that ordered production cutbacks in order to force wages and prices above market levels. Cutbacks. The economy just suffered 4 years of severe contraction, and we're getting cutbacks. How in the world could people be put back to work when the government is forcing production cutbacks? Not until 1935, the summer of 1935, after the Supreme Court had struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, did a recovery begin anew. And that continued for 2 years, nearly 2 years, until 1937, when the consequences of what's known as the Second New Deal laws became apparent, namely the Social Security Act, excise taxes on payrolls, the undistributed profits tax, and the Wagner Act that promoted unionization of mass production industries and led to the big wage increases of 1937. Those three things, together with blunders at the Federal Reserve, which had been centralized by FDR under the Banking Act of 1935, led to the Depression of 1938. So the economy was trying to recover. There was growth of the gross national product, but double-digit employment continued, and that's why I'm focusing on this. Political historians give FDR credit for handling the political crisis of the 1930s, the worst political crisis this country has faced since the Civil War. But the most important factor in that crisis was double-digit unemployment prolonged by FDR's own New Deal policies. The truth about the New Deal can no longer be denied. Stanford University political historian David M. Kennedy, though an admirer of FDR, had the integrity to engage some of the new evidence that I report fully in FDR's Folly. I'm referring to Kennedy's 1990 book, Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War, that was a Pulitzer Prize winner. Kennedy reported FDR's, quote, conspicuous failure to produce economic recovery. Kennedy wrote, Roosevelt stood before the world in 1938 as a badly weakened leader, unable to cure his own country's apparently endless economic crisis. In the 9th year of the Great Depression and the 6th year of Roosevelt's New Deal, with more than 10 million workers still unemployed, America had not found a formula for economic recovery. Kennedy continued, whatever it was, Roosevelt conclusively demonstrated in 1938 that the New Deal was not a recovery program. The last thing we need is more big government. A principal lesson from the failure of the New Deal is that government will best promote prosperity by letting people keep more of their money, removing obstacles to productive enterprise, making it easier for employers to hire people, providing stable money and a political climate where people feel it's safe to invest for the future. Thank you.